well and truly try the matter at issue between plaintiff and defendant, and a true verdict rendered according to the...
The dad is on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 6, and 6. There he is. Okay, speak into the mic.
You gotta go clear up here to get into the mic.
No, his mic will just pick you up.
It'll pick me up anywhere, huh?
Well, if we want to experiment. See how
Yeah.
it is. Can you see yourself there?
Yeah, I've got a multiple picture on 6.
What?
That last camera I have.
Well, that's just your set.
Just in my
This is the one for broadcasting on. Turn that box.
this one here.
And that's it.
Yeah.
Okay. Now.
Forward any evidence to you, and that burden exists throughout the trial and clear to the time when you retire to the jury room. The role I play here is to act on the law. You, in turn, will act on the facts as you hear them from the witness stand here. I'll remind you at this point that arguments made by the two gentlemen who are representing the two parties here.
Let's hear from you. Say something.
I don't know what to
How
say.
about sit up a little bit closer.
Well, I'll just say, hi, Bobby.
You see her?
And he said he was looking at me.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
You should pull your chair closer than that to get in the screen better. Is that right up there?
Is that better?
Much better.
Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Oh, good, because then I won't have to strain my voice.
Speak to the jury.
Yes,
Now, let me
Judy.
see if I can work that out. When you say that. Okay, Bob, what did you say?
Speak to the jury, please.
Well, the jury is listening.
Okay. Go ahead, Mom.
Oh, Uncle Arthur hasn't come yet, and it's at 1:30.
Gramps?
Well, we actually don't require an audience, but as long as they're not here, suppose you recite one of your favorite poems for the two of us.
I don't know any favorite poems. I might say, oh Lord, I thank thee for thy care and all thy mercy sends, the food we eat, the clothes we wear, our health, our home, our friends, amen. How's that?
That's fine. Amen.
Oh.
She's already there.
Well, let me sit you here, young lady. Is she coming on your screen, Dad?
Yeah,
Of course, he'll sit higher than I do.
What does she look like?
she's in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen.
Never forget?
Never. Uncle Arthur will sit higher. Would you rather sit here to see how
If you want her in the middle, try the next chair.
Yeah, move over the next chair, Mom.
Which way?
That way.
That way.
Yeah, that puts you right in the middle.
And then I'll sit a little high. I'll be Uncle Arthur would sit like
There.
this.
Sit. Wait, Mom. How's that?
That's just fine. That's fine. Okay,
Toward me.
we're contemplating taking up the study of genealogy, or perhaps just a minor research in your own family. And to begin with, you need a few tools. The first of all is a pedigree chart, which begins with the first generation, which you might take as, presuming a married couple, your children in the number 1 spot, then the father in the number 2 spot, which occurs at the top of the page, and the mother at the bottom, and these list the date when born, where you were born, when you were married, when you died, and where. And the bottom was, of course, where the mother was born, where she lived, where she died, and where she's buried. And then you advance over into the third column with the numeral number 4, the father, or in this case the grandfather, and then the grandmother in that bracket. and with the same data we listed before. And down below, the mother's father and mother and their information. Then in the fourth column would be the great-grandparents of both on the father's side and the mother's side, and down below of the mother's father's side and the mother's side. And you end up on the right-hand side with the fifth generation. And when you get that all done, then you can advance to what is known as the Mormon's 15 generation chart. It looks like this. It's about 2.5 feet square, and it has up to the 6th great-grandparents on the front, and on up to, as we said before, the 15th generation or the 11th great-grandparents on the back. And these are in 2 columns. You first come down on the left-hand side and fill that up. Go on over to the right-hand side, fill that up. And then if you're lucky enough to have that much information, you can go on to any number of charts that are blank on the back and fill them up to your heart's content. Then we have another type of tool which is quite handy and informative, but not near as much room for data, and that is what we call a fan. That's takes the right angle section of a circle, and you can list 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 generations on that chart. And you can list that for the father, for the mother, and you'll end up with a half a circle. And that's a very handy tool. The only thing is that you have to learn to write real small if you expect to read it, or use a magnifying glass. And another chart that's quite necessary, especially in the later generations, is the family chart showing the husband's name, date of birth, when he was christened, when he died, buried, married, other wives, if any, and his father, and then the mother's name with the similar data for her. And then down below is a provision for 13 children of these parents. And it shows whether they're male or female, their names, when they were born, where they were born, where they were married, or whom they married, and when the child died, not the parent, not the spouse, and then where they were buried. That's very useful, especially since a lot of the printed data fails to list all the children, and you cannot believe verbatim any of these books on genealogy, because they all err more or less, some a lot more than less. And we hope that that will do you some good in case you want to take this up.
Uncle Art, do you want to add any editorial in here as to what you've got in front of you?
No, not a thing. Very good all the way through.
Okay.
To illustrate the procedure on this Mormon chart, you have to just stick with one family and take it as far as you can go, preferably to the immigrant to this country, which in our families is usually in the early 1600s. And we'll just take the parentage of Judge Robert Jones of Portland, and for an illustration, his father was Howard Caswell Jones, his grandfather Burton Howard Jones, his great-grandfather Publius Virgilius Jones, and second great-grandfather was Judge Lines Jones of Jefferson, Ohio, And his third great-grandparent was Colonel Israel Jones of Enfield, Connecticut. And his fourth great-grandparent was Captain Israel Jones, also of Enfield. His fifth great-grandparent, Lieutenant Thomas Jones of Somers, Connecticut. And his sixth great-grandparent was Benjamin Jones of Enfield, Connecticut, and Somers. And his seventh great-grandparent was Thomas Jones, the original immigrant to the colonies who came over in 1629 on the second voyage of the Mayflower. Actually, it was not the original ship, but another ship with the same name, which ended up as rather a ferry between England and the colonies, or New England specifically, over the next 10 years. And then his mother was Leita Estelle Hendricks. His grandmother, Maud Alice Crandall Hendricks. I won't give their married name, I'll just give their maiden name. His great-grandmother was Eliza Ann Lorena Kuhn, and his second great-grandparent was Polly Stillman, and so on down the line. On the Stillman side, Elisha Stillman and Elisha Stillman Sr., George Stillman Jr., George Stillman Sr., who came over to this country, or to the colonies rather, in the early 1600s, and whose wife died at sea. And we could take any number of these, but I think next I will go on down to what we call the Palmer line. Walter Palmer was the original immigrant to the colonies. He came over with Winthrop in the famous Winthrop fleet in 1630 to Boston, Massachusetts. And Walter was married twice. His first wife's name was Anne or Elizabeth. History doesn't say for sure which it was. And a second wife named Rebecca Short. And both Leita and I are descended from both of Walter Palmer's wives through at least three of his children. And one of the lines runs this way: Walter Palmer and his second wife, Rebecca Short. Son Nehemiah Palmer married Hannah Stanton, the daughter of Thomas Stanton, Jr., the son of Thomas Stanton, who married Catherine Washington. And there he had a child, Joseph Palmer, who married Frances Prentice. And their child, Hannah Palmer, married a cousin, George Palmer, who was the son of Gershom Palmer, whose wife was Ann Dennison. And then they had a son, Reverend Gershom Palmer, whose wife was Dorothy Brown. And their daughter, Keturah Palmer, married Jacob Burton. And Jacob Burton and Keturah's son, Reverend William Palmer, married Margaret Hughes. And their daughter, Lavinia Burton, married Publius Virgilius Jones. They were my grandparents, and Judge Jones' great-grandparents. And we have, I think between Leita and I, we have about 7 lines to Walter Palmer. And another similar occurrence is in the Hubbard line. The original immigrants of the Hubbard line were Samuel Hubbard and his sister. What's his sister's name? Bethia? No.
Rebecca.
Just a second here while I look this up. Can you hold that, Bob?
Sure.
Samuel Hubbard and his sister Rebecca Hubbard came over at the same time, and Samuel's father, their fathers, both their father, was James Hubbard, and his father was Thomas Hubbard, the martyr who was burned at the stake during the reign of Bloody Mary for religious heritage and whatnot. Anyway, these two immigrants, Rebecca married
I don't know.
Phillips, Major Phillips. No, John Brundage. She married John Brundage, and the Jones line comes down from her. And Samuel Hubbard had 3 daughters and a son. The son died without issue, and the 3 daughters lived to provide plenty of progeny. The Hendricks side comes down from her, these 3 girls,
All 3 of them.
in at least 7 different circumstances. And another one, let me introduce my brother and compatriot in crime, Dr. Arthur Jones, who was an original instigator of this genealogy bit, along with his big sister Margaret. And between us, the bunch of us, and my wife's older sister Vera, we originally implanted a family chart in the Compendium of American Genealogy back in the early 1930s.
That's right.
Volume 6, if you insist on looking it up. Now go back to the Palmer line here. I finally found out a little bit more information on my fan. We have Walter Palmer and his son Nehemiah Palmer, who's, let's see here. What happened to him? There's a gap in that. This fan is in error. There's a missing generation. Well, we'll take Walter and his son Nehemiah Palmer, whose son was Joseph Palmer, whose daughter Hannah Palmer married George Palmer, and their son Gershom Palmer. And Dorothy Brown had a daughter, Keturah Palmer, who married Jacob Burton. That's as I told you before. And then we have Walter Palmer and his wife Rebecca Short. Well, that's Gershom Palmer also, and his wife Ann Dennison. So we have them coming in there a couple of times. And then we have Walter and his son Joseph Palmer, whose daughter Hannah married George Palmer. Well, you're back at the old farm again. But now to go into the search for the correct people in this, the family Bible in this case was in error. They had Silence Brown listed as Silena Brown, and Silence Herrick listed as Silena Herrick. Well, now I just confused you on that. I gave it to you all wrong. It was as bad as the family Bible, so don't believe a word. We'll go back again to George Palmer and his wife Hannah Palmer, whose son Gershom Palmer married Dorothy Brown. She was listed in the family Bible as Silence Brown, but we have her record of her marriage in North Stonington Congregational Church, and her name was actually Dorothy. She never was Silence or Selena. And Silence Herrick, who married Israel Burton, is listed in the family Bible as Silena Herrick. Well, she probably was called Silena all through her life, but her birth record says that she was Silence Herrick, and also her marriage record, also at the North Stonington Congregational Church, which we have. So that finally straightened that all out. Now, just recently, we've come into possession of further information that we could only go to William Burton's father, Jacob Burton, and his wife, Keturah Palmer. But we've run down his father, who was Israel Burton, married to Silence Herrick, and recently found his father, Jacob Burton, who was married to Judith Herrick. And his father was Isaac Burton, whose wife's name was Hannah something or other. The name is unknown. And his father was John Burton. And we don't know anything about his wife's name.
So that carries it back 3 more
So
generations.
that takes us back now to probably John Burton was the immigrant. Now, there's further research to be done on that particular line. Many of these other lines of Jones' genealogy, which of course includes all of the wives and relatives and collaterals, run back to British royalty, or royalty, a European royalty really, because once you hit one of them, you've got them all. And they're known through publications called the Magna Carta Barons and the sureties issued by Burke. I think there's one author, and the other one was Wirtz. And you can find them in any big library where it has genealogical references available. And we were fortunate or unfortunate, whichever way you want to look at it, in being brought back to these people through the Gallops, the Lakes, the Morgans, the Miners, and the Mullins lines. And all of the brothers and sisters that I have been provided with some of those charts at least.
Well, that Mullins was originally de Molyneux.
Well, the spelling of names doesn't mean a thing, because in those days very few people could write, and the clerks who did take down this information wrote it whatever way it sounded to them at the moment. They might write it one way today and another way tomorrow. But anyway, most of it, you'll find some references that index these names phonetically and not alphabetically, and you're put to a real hard time to try to look up any of them. For instance, one of them is what was it? I think it's early marriages of, the early marriages of Connecticut. And they're in 7 volumes condensed into one volume with separate indexes for each volume, and each one spelled phonetically, and they are not even consistent on one index to the other. So
I'm sure that's happened over and over again. That's why genealogy is an art rather than a science.
right. You have to use your head. Don't take anything for granted. But it's a lot of fun, and it's better than working crossword puzzles.
Well, why don't you tell us about this problem you can't solve, this one answer?
We've got one stumbling block. Well, we have several as far as that goes, but this one in particular pertains to the Babcocks and the Maxons. We can trace a lot of these lines up to a point and down to a point. We know what family they came from. We know what family they're married into, but we cannot specify their name. This one instance is a descendant of the Maxon line. We get her down to Ruth, from the original immigrant, Richard Maxon, down to Ruth Maxon, who married a Babcock, and their daughter Ruth Babcock married a Peabody. Well, the Peabody line is right straight down the alley, and we know that Thomas Peabody married a Ruth Babcock, but we absolutely cannot find her father's name. We're sure that her mother was Ruth Babcock. And a little confusing in here, too, is the fact that Ruth Maxon had a niece, Ruth Maxon, who married a Rouse Babcock. Well, she's a generation too late. And family legend or history or whatever you want to call it, gossip perhaps, before my time have variously used Benjamin Babcock as Ruth Maxon's husband, and another one was Thomas Babcock. But Thomas Babcock was born in 1710. They were married in 1727. Ruth was born in 1703. And Thomas Babcock supposedly was married previously and had 2 children. Now that's pretty precocious, even for those early days. And he later married another woman named Judith Davis, and they had children. And we verified that it was not Thomas because the early church records are examined, and some genealogist at some previous time who published a book read the faint writing Judith as Ruth. And that's the only statement of any kind at any time that ever said that Thomas Babcock's wife was Ruth Maxon.
What role did your sister Margaret play in all this?
Yeah, my sister Margaret, of course, was the instigator of the whole thing. She was interested in this from her earliest childhood because my mother and her mother, in her turn, knew an awful lot about the early genealogy, particularly of the Carhart and Chesebro families. And our Chesebro line runs for 7 generations in this country before the name changed to Carhart, and then changed from Carhart to Tallman, and from Tallman to Jones. And my brother Arthur's middle name is Carhart. My grandmother, speaking of spelling of names, preferred the double T, and she used that all her life. But the bulk of the other Carhart ancestors spelled it with just a single T.
Dad, on the subject of spelling, did you cover the Tallman spellings?
No, I didn't discover it. My mother told me about that when I was a kid. My granddad, for some reason or other, decided that he didn't like the spelling Tallman, so he changed it to M-O-N, Tallmon. And my dad had either forgotten about it, because one time he was writing a letter to one of his sisters-in-law, and he addressed the envelope to Tallman. And I said, no, that's not the way to spell Tallman. You spell that with an O. And he says, something about Hootman, where did that come in? And I says, well, I've been there all your life. And so we checked out with my mother, and she verified that the spelling was M-O-N. I think Dad knew it all the time, but he'd just forgotten it.
Uncle Art, do you remember Grandpa Tallman?
Oh, very well. He was a great old patriarch with a long gray beard that came well down to his belt line, and he had steely gray eyes and partly bald head, and he was able to look a line right through you, you know, if he had any suspicion that perhaps you weren't telling him the truth or all of the truth. So it'd say nothing but the truth. And he was a rather stern disciplinarian to all his family, the girls and his boys. And yet he was very much beloved by most of the daughters, and was firmly defended by my Aunt Clover, who was particularly a favorite of his, I think. And the youngest Aunt Edith Tallman, who married Hubbard Parks, they just wouldn't hear anything wrong about Grandpa Tallman. Well, Grandpa Tallman was quite an individualist. He taught a good deal when he was younger, as well as farming, and he persuaded his brother David, Uncle Dave we always called him, to change his name spelling to Tallmon. And this same great Uncle Dave, great uncle to Howard and me, went up into South Dakota near Aberdeen and was a farmer there. But his children came west, at least two of the boys did, Arthur Tallman and his brother Charles Tallman. And they both had fairly sizable families. And there are Tallmans who spell their name the same way that grandfather George Washington and great uncle Dave did. And they're scattered around this neighborhood now. We looked up the surname the other day, and there are at least 5 or 6 Tallmon families in the Portland area. And I haven't been able to reach one of them by phone just lately. But Uncle Dave was more obviously Indian than our grandfather George Washington, who had gray eyes, fairly high cheekbones, but was quite fair with curly hair. But Uncle Dave had straight black hair and dark brown eyes, and high cheekbones, and had more of the Indian look. And you perhaps don't know, but our later generations must realize that we're partly Mohawk Indian.
What percentage?
1/16.
That's for you.
That would be Howard and I would be 1/16. You would be 1/32, and Jeff would be 1/64 Mohawk.
We probably ought to get a date on this tape, by the way, while we're thinking about it.
Well, this is
29th of October.
October 29th, the last day of daylight saving this year.
1977.
And that makes you how old, Uncle Art?
I'm 81 as of the 4th of September this year.
And Dad?
I'm staring at 79 on Christmas Day.
And that was a cheat, because he should have had some other birthday. He never got birthday presents. He always got Christmas presents.
I've been happy with it. It helps out when you get older.
Yeah.
Well, how about tell us about your mother that you fellas want to go to that now, Dad? Or are you through the genealogy chart?
Yeah, I think we might just as well. We don't need to go back on any of this.
Any party shots about the specific genealogy things that you want your future generations to pursue?
Well, we're primarily interested in extending all of the unknowns as far as we can go. Oftentimes you can recover them. Now, this fan that I have here today is one I got from my brother Francis, who didn't even know he had it. And Margaret is built up by Margaret, and it has a lot of information on it that I don't have. I have just the wife's name with a blank space after it, and she has the names and perhaps their parents, maybe for 2 or 3 generations beyond. Now, oftentimes further research will bring it out, and then it oftentimes leads to some other information. Now, just for instance, on this Dorothy Brown business that I spoke about earlier, the family Bible had it down as Silence Brown. Well, I identified that it was Dorothy, and that just recently I found out that her father was Thomas Brown III, whose wife was Deborah Holdridge, and his father was Thomas Brown, who married Hannah Collins, and his father was Thomas Brown, who married Mary Newhall. Now, the Chesebro genealogy has a chart of Robert Chesebro, which states that Thomas Brown's father was Peter Brown of the Mayflower. However, we know that Peter Brown had about 5 kids, and all of them were girls. And he died fairly young. He died in 1630 at the second sweep of the general sickness that hit the Plymouth colony. So we're almost certain that Thomas Brown's father wasn't Peter Brown. And Margaret has on this chart here that his father was Nicholas Brown. No, we don't know anything further about that. It's subject to further research.
When you come to the names Brown or Smith or Jones, you're
Well, the
pretty much
Joneses-
in the jungle.
The Joneses have at least 3 Brown lines, and it's possible that one of them will hook into the other, just as this particular circumstance it did.
Yeah.
And the Smiths, the same. We have several Smith lines. They may all, one or more, hook up with the others. So it's a lot of fun working it out, and then the ones who are to follow us will probably, if they get a winner, just like little Steve, he's done some research back in Hartford and in Eastern Library, Plainfield. He went down there to the museum and searched around. But
That's Roger's son.
yeah, Steve wrote back and he says, well, he says it's a lot of fun looking this stuff up, but it'd be a lot more fun if you could hit a winner once in a while. Yeah. So we just have.
I can't be quite sure out here. It was, let me ask you what that was. I guess if this is Thornton, Phoebe Thornton, that's the third wife. That's no particular.
Yeah, no interest to us.
Yeah, Brewster.
That's Jonathan Brewster's daughter that was first married to Thompson,
Yeah.
second to Starr, Samuel Starr.
Well, that's okay. Oh, here's Phoebe Holcomb.
Dad, you want to slide over a little closer, Uncle Art?
Yeah.
Let's see if I can get you two guys
Ouch.
together. What happened? You bang your knuckles?
Hit my bingy. Hit my bingy. Some guy went and burned a hole in my hand the other day.
Sure did, didn't they? You asked for the stinger, and I sure stung you.
Yeah.
Dag nabbit.
Well,
There
now,
was some name that
I
I was.
ran into a boo-boo here when I was on the air there. You gotta watch these numbers, see, 2, 4, 5, 6. That's where it belonged. There's Hannah Palmer or Walter Palmer. And right here, see there? Now, what's Benjamin Hewitt and Mary doing in here? Somebody put,
Put Thomas Hewitt here.
yeah,
So,
you see there's a boo-boo in here. Now I have to figure that out. What we have to do is actually make another chart and change all of these the way they're in there.
this Fanning here, though, is opposite Fanning, Mary Fanning. And she and Benjamin Hewitt were married, and their daughter was Tabitha. Well, that figures out.
Thomas Hewitt and Hannah Palmer. Okay, that made Benjamin Hewitt. And he and Mary Fanning. Here's the Fannings. Yeah, that's all right. Tabitha Hewitt married Timothy Herrick. Okay, yeah, that's all right.
It's okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
There's see, there are 2 brothers.
Yes.
Timothy Carrick and what was the other one?
Herrick.
Another generation you got to jump over. Timothy and his brother. I got to find another Ephraim Herrick in here. Here it is, right here.
There's Ephraim.
Judith Herrick and Timothy Herrick are brother and sister.
Yes.
Isn't that right? Wait a minute. Whoop, whoop, whoop. No, it isn't either. Judith's father was Ephraim. The mother was Judith Woodbury. And Timothy's was Ephraim Herrick. He's Ephraim Herrick 2, and this is Ephraim Herrick 1. See, there's a
Oh, yes. Well, there's a skip of a generation.
niece and uncle or whatnot in there.
Yes.
Yeah, but he's a brother of somebody else. Ephraim Herrick 1. Now, if you find Ephraim. I haven't gone over this complete.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can find Ephraim Herrick 1 again, you'll find it. There's another, the Carricks, or Herricks, I mean, that's, here, it's gotta be out here. There's Ephraim Herrick number 1.
Yeah.
And his son Ephraim, well, naturally.
Yeah,
Ephraim and Timothy are brothers.
yeah.
Yeah, that's what's good.
Okay, you guys ready to go?
Yep.
Let's see what we got here. You want? Just say something into the mic, I guess.
Well, what,
Yeah.
you want to talk about
Your
our
mom and dad.
Mom and dad?
I
Their
guess is the best thing.
characteristics?
Just a second. Yeah, why don't you just give us some of your reminiscences? Uncle Art, why don't you start out since you got here first? What you remember about 1895 at SEC?
Well, I'd be hard put it to remember 1895 because that was the year before I was born. I was born on 4th of September 1896 in my Uncle Lyons and Aunt Clara's home in Oberlin, Ohio. And the first memories I have are not of Oberlin, Ohio at all, but of western Nebraska up in Hyannis first and then Hay Springs. And I doubt that I really validly remember Hyannis because I was only 2 when we moved away from there to Hay Springs. And Howard was born on Christmas Day of 1898. So I was just a few months beyond 2 years old when Howard was the new baby. Of course, that broke my nose. But to go back to those earliest days, we ought to have some word picture of our mother, Angelina Carhart Tallman Jones. Her middle name was Carhart before she married Dad, and she carried that Carhart middle name for a long time because she was real proud of it. And she was proud to give me that middle name as my middle name, and I was always very ashamed of it in my earlier youth, but I got so I was real proud of it later on when I found out what kind of people the Carharts were. Anyway, Mother was of medium height. I think she must have been 5'5" at least.
Oh, no.
5'4".
I don't think
Okay.
she's over 5'2".
Well, she was a little taller than that. But anyway, she was a fairly sturdy build in spite of that, and she always wore her almost black hair combed back from her forehead over the back and done up in a bun behind her head. And that's the way I remember her mostly. She had a real beautiful complexion, peaches and cream when she was younger, and kept that complexion well into her later years. And she had a very gentle disposition. She was kindly and gentle and always smiling to us children and to Dad, and she wasn't easily angered, and when she was put out about something, she didn't stay angry very long. She was capable of spanking us when we needed it, and we needed it often, probably more often than we got it. But she was a peacemaker by nature and had been the mother to her younger sisters for years because her mother had been ill with very crippling arthritis and hadn't been able to do much from the time Angie was in her early teens. So Angie had been the cook and housekeeper and foster mother to her younger sisters and always making peace among them. And so she had a naturally very loving and helpful disposition. And she was a great storyteller. She would tell us stories and she would read aloud to us. And we had a really delightful childhood in that respect. She was always bringing up something that would be interesting to us children. She'd take us out in the starry night. I can remember in Nebraska where the skies are so clear. We'd go out and look up at the stars and she'd point out different constellations and stars and name them for us. You see, she had had some schooling in astronomy at Grinnell College and had done a good deal of reading about it and had an amazing amount of scientific information at a time when most housewives didn't know much of anything about science. I think part of that came from her association with the Agassiz Society. They formed a young people's society mainly devoted to scientific subjects there in Grinnell, and whether it was church connected at the time or not, I don't know. But the Tallman girls, at least the older ones, and the Jones boys, that was Lyons and Burton and Arthur particularly, were active in this Agassiz Society. And each one had to give a paper at a certain time. And what papers Mother gave, I don't know, but Dad made the study of, I think, amphibia and bugs, although he didn't follow that interest much. And Art was interested in rocks and geology, and Lyons was particularly interested in birds and got to know a lot about birds. So this Agassiz group met for several years around Grinnell, and that was part of her basic interest in science. And she passed that on to us. And then she was also interested in the folklore, and she told us fairy stories to some extent. And she took us back into genealogy and told us stories about our ancestors. I can remember her telling about her mother and her childhood in New York State, up there in the region around Guilderland, which is up above Albany in the Helderberg country. And Guilderland, she was remembering that Guilderland was a tough little town when her grandmother first moved there. And they used to call it Bangall because a stranger coming into town was very apt to be beaten up by some of the roughs of the town. And that's where we had our meeting with some of the Dutch ancestry. One of the New Amsterdam Dutch families was connected with ours, so the Van Rensselaers there in that part of New York. The Van Rensselaers had been originally patroons from the New Amsterdam Dutch families that moved up into the Hudson Valley and took up land. She used to jokingly say, well, we didn't come from the rich Van Rensselaers, we came from the poor side of the family. So she told stories about the Cheeseboro brothers and their teaching school in upper New York State in their early years, and something about the Cheeseboro letters, which we have a record. I think Bob has copies of those too. And she told us about Hannah Rau, who was probably German in ancestry and spelled her name variously, R-A-U and R-O-W-E. But Hannah Rau was obviously German. I don't know whether she was from the Palatinate or from the Low Countries. I really don't.
Well, we have quite a segment of the chart is taken up with the Zollpags, the von Wageners, the Schneiders, the Raus, the Cudneys. In fact, if you want to go back into one of your European ancestors, you were a Lazouche.
A Lazouche. That's
Believe it or
new
not.
on me.
So you got everything from Alden to Zollpag.
Jawohl. Well, anyway, she was quite good at reminiscing about her relatives and ancestors, and she was very fond of the Carhart boys who lived around Grinnell. See, the Carharts went out to Grinnell and were pretty well known there in various businesses, and one of them was the lumber business. Some of the Carhart boys had a lumber yard there at Grinnell. And she would reminisce about her cousins, particularly Albert Carhart, and I think Lester Carhart.
John?
And John Carhart, yes. Well, her grandfather was John Carhart. Susan Carhart was the daughter of John Carhart, and she married George Washington Tallman. So we got a good deal more information about relatives and ancestors from our mother than most children did. She knew a lot about George Washington Tallman and his youth and his experiences during the Civil War, and how her mother went down into Louisiana, went down the Mississippi River on a steamboat while they were still fighting along the river, and Vicksburg was still under siege. And she got past Vicksburg and got clear down into Baton Rouge, where she met George, who was then assigned to a Negro work battalion, and was, of course, a special target for any Confederate sympathizers, and was under some danger there in his camp, where he had charge of these colored recruits from slavery down there in that Baton Rouge country.
I have some of his original documents signed by him during the Civil War at Baton Rouge, where he lists a transfer of property to one part of the Army to another. And it might list, for instance, 1 wagon, 8 horses, and 16 Negroes.
Yeah, it just was kind of chattels.
Yeah, well,
Still.
sure. Well, their property, after all, they were all released slaves freed slaves that they had down there, and they were considered contraband by the rebels.
Yeah. Oh, that's one reason why they were afraid of some of those buccaneers and, or rather, bushwhackers out around the area, because there was a certain amount of guerrilla warfare going on in Louisiana and down in all through the South, I guess. And one time the whole contingent, including wives and children, were ordered to go over by the Mississippi River bank to be evacuated in case the rebels that they had heard about farther west came on in through the camp. Well, they didn't ever come there, but I guess it was a pretty frightening time, and families were separated for a while there. Had to live under primitive conditions and in tents and on short rations until the federal soldiers could come in and reinforce the Union men who were there at the time.
I might say here, Art, that when grandmother went south, she took her infant daughter with her,
Yes,
Grace,
first
And-
daughter. Yeah.
their first child, and they were married in 1862. And the baby was quite small, and when they did finally get down there, the baby only survived a few months. She died before she was a year old. And I believe cholera infantum, I'm not too sure, but I think it was something of that nature.
I think they often called it cholera infantum when it was any intestinal disease. And there was a lot of bacillary dysentery and that sort of thing,
That's
too.
right, yeah.
So she could so easily have picked up something like that. It was almost as good as a death warrant to a little child to take her into that country at that time under those circumstances.
And then their second daughter was born down there, and she picked out her middle name as they named her Ada, and she picked out the middle name of Morganza to commemorate her birthplace.
Yeah. Ada Morganza Tallman. And she survived that situation and was taken north to a place not far from Davenport. Mother told us all about these things, you see. And they got back up into the Iowa country, and grandfather George W. bought land near Davenport and had a big farm, which they called the
Circle Grove,
Wild Rose Farm.
Wild
wasn't it?
Rose Farm.
Wild Rose Farm, I think. And Mother always told a very dramatic story about a head-on railroad collision that occurred right where they could see it. There was a railroad cut that came around a curve and out onto a trestle or small bridge there right on the ranch, or at the edge of the ranch where grandfather was farming. And Mother, as a little girl, was out in the yard and heard a train whistle in one direction, and she heard a train whistle from the other direction, and she just knew that something terrible was going to happen because these trains were coming in opposite directions and it was a one-track line. So she ran in to shout to her mother, and they came out in time to see these engines coming toward each other, and they met, I think, on the bridge. And Mother said that the engines both just sort of stood up on end, you might say, and then toppled over off the bridge.
And her dad said that's a hell of a way to run a railroad.
Yeah. That was really a traumatic experience for her. Another thing that she used to tell us a good deal about was the animals on the farm, this particular farm. And one of the animals that she was very fond of, but, well, no, she wasn't so fond of the animal, but she was...
Well acquainted with it.
A mule named Bill William. And this mule was a mischievous mule and used to chase the children. And one time on a icy day, Mother said she was out in the meadow doing something or another, and she didn't know Billy William was loose in the meadow, but he was, and he came galloping over toward where she was trying to get across this field and dragging her sled behind her. And there was a little ditch in the field, and as Billy William got closer to her, she didn't know what else to do, but she jumped down into this little ditch, which was frozen, and pulled the sled over her head so that the mule couldn't get at her. And the mule carried on for a while and galloped around there, and he reached down underneath the sled and took hold of her hood and pulled her hood off, and then jumped up on his hind legs and waved the hood in the air and in great triumph. And about that time, Grandfather Tallman heard the noise and came out with a pitchfork and drove old Bill William away. But Mother said she swore that she always had a little place in the middle of her scalp where she had been scalped by having the hair pulled out along with the hood. And I don't doubt it.
Another tale Mother used to tell about Hay Springs. This is on the Niobrara River in western Nebraska. There was
That's where Howard was
saloon
born.
keeper there that was pestered by the Indians for whiskey, and these old Indians would come in and do everything they could think of to get whiskey for nothing because they didn't have any money. And this one old brave came in one day, and he had a wicker basket over his arm. And the bartender thought he'd get smart, so he says, "Okay, Chief," he says, "I'll give you all the whiskey you can hold in that basket." So being wintertime, the chief went down to the Niobrara River, and he chopped a hole in the ice, stuck the basket down the hole and wet it good, brought it out and let it freeze in the air. He did that 6 or 8 times till he finally had a coat of ice all over that basket. Then he went back to the saloon and demanded his reward.
And he got it.
The bar flies around there made the barkeep fill up his basket with raw whiskey.
Oh, boy.
That's a good...
Do you remember San Francisco?
Oh, well, that's another long story, and sometime later. See, we lived in Hyannis first, then in Hay Springs, where Howard was born, and then we went to a little town named Sargent down in farther east in Nebraska. Then we moved to Smith Center, Kansas, which is in the middle of Smith County, and then to Valley Falls, Kansas, which is the place where I went to first grade. And we left Valley Falls, Kansas to come west to California in March of 1904. And Howard and Dorothy and Margaret and our mother all had gone west earlier because they wanted to be there for the wedding of our Aunt Lucy, who was then living in Berkeley, and become engaged to a young lawyer there. So they went out west on the Santa Fe Railroad, and Lester and I stayed with our dad at Smith's at Valley Falls and helped to finish packing, and then we all took the train
a little short line train to Topeka, and from Topeka, the cross-country Union Pacific to Berkeley by way of Salt Lake.
Why don't we pick up on the next tape on once you get to California, okay?
Okay?
Before you do that, do you remember where you both, was Dad really born in the sod hut?
No, it wasn't sod. It was-
Dorothy was.
Dorothy was born in the sod hut in Sargent, Nebraska.
Were you old enough to remember that at all?
Oh, yes, I remember it very well.
Okay, well, we'll get back to that in just a minute.
You like to
of the trial. Prosecutor can defeat that presumption of innocence only by showing that beyond a reasonable doubt she's guilty of the crime she was indicted for.